Good afternoon from our studio in Amsterdam today. I'm honored to have Jojo Mehta, one of the co-founders of Stop Ecocide International. And for those, including me, who don't know what is Stop Ecocide International and who is Jojo Mehta, briefly tell us what is that, what you do, what your big purpose is, and also a clear definition of what is ecocide.
Thank you so much. It's really great to be with you. So, our organization, Stop Ecocide International, works across the world with governments and also across civil society to move forward legislation to criminalize the worst harms to nature. In other words, ecocide. So we have these two layers of work. We do a lot of work with government ministers, ambassadors, legal advisors around supporting those governments to move forward with this legislation. So we're in the kind of pre-legislative space, if you see what I mean. And then the other side of it is more around the public narrative and building the conversation around ecocide, in a very cross-sector way. And we do that all over the world. So that's our kind of raison d'etre, is to have ecocide recognized as a serious crime all around the world at national, regional, and international levels. And when we talk about ecocide, what we're really referring to are the worst harms to nature. We're not talking about chopping down the trees on the village green. We're talking about the kind of severe, widespread, and long-term harm that has, really serious effects on ecosystem integrity. Both, it can obviously be in a very local way, but very intense, or can also be harms that actually affect the global balance of environmental integrity.
But is it the loss of habitat? Is it biodiversity? Is it air pollution? Are all of those ecocide?
Any of those could be in its sort of most extreme forms. I think that's the most important thing. Our foundation, we have a charitable foundation as well, convened a panel of international lawyers back in 2021 who spent 6 months drafting a legal definition of ecocide, because the term ecocide actually goes back to 1970. It was originally used to describe the awful damage created in Vietnam by Agent Orange, the defoe.
Sure.
So the original context was military, but it kind of remained, the concept remained a little bit in a sort of political and legal backwater, you could say, until it was really brought back into the public domain by my dear departed co-founder, Polly Higgins, in the sort of 2010s. And effectively, what we are looking at is not a law that will focus on a particular activity. Those lawyers that we convened back in 2021 came up with a definition that is strongly based on preceding laws like the Geneva Protocols, like the Environmental Modification Convention, and indeed like the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. But the language is very straightforward. And in fact, the core of the definition fits on the back of my business card, which I
Oh,
cannot
please
tell
read
you.
it. Please read it.
Okay, so I will read it. So, ecocide means unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there's a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts.
And
So,
this is the liability is the individual? Is it the corporation? Is it the LLC? Is it the B Corp? Do they all hide behind something to avoid liability?
absolutely, which is why it's very important that we focus on the criminal side of things, because with a criminal law, what you're looking at is potential individual liability. Now, when these laws are enacted at
Okay, okay, okay.
when these laws are enacted at the national or regional level, it can also include corporate accountability. But when you're looking at an international crime, you're definitely looking at individual personal responsibility. And that is absolutely key, because when you are looking at environmental law and regulation as it currently stands around the world, now there's of course, a large body of such regulation that is protective of the environment. But most of it is in the kind of administrative regulatory sphere, where it's long lists of do's and don'ts, lots of very precise kind of, things like toxin limits, for example. And that system is very important, but it can also be played by those who have pockets deep enough to do so, in the sense that, if there's a limit to a certain toxin in a certain context, you might want to stay at that limit the whole time. And if you get caught going over it, then you might pay a fine. But effectively, nobody is held specifically accountable in the way that would actually deter that harmful activity from happening in the first place. And that, of course, is, what criminal law can bring into the picture. And I think it's very important that we understand criminal law for what it really is, because I think one of the instant responses that people sometimes have is that, criminal law is a mechanism for punishment. That is how it works, but that's not what it's there for. Ultimately, criminal law is protective law. I mean, murder's not a crime in order to punish murderers. It's a crime in order to stop us killing each other. And effectively, that is the principle on which it works. And it taps into what we consider acceptable and not acceptable. And at the moment, in most of the world, there is no parameter that says really severe harm to the environment is just bad, wrong, and unacceptable.
But you're not a litigation fund. You're not working with a litigation fund to fund these claims. You're taking on the most difficult group, convincing politicians and the nerdy bureaucrats to come up with a legal framework
Yeah.
that will be the ecocide law. And you
Hmm.
want that pretty universal, but not each country has the same level of ecocide activity. Why did you choose that way?
I mean, what's interesting is that when Polly and I first, co-founded this organization, Polly had already been working on this concept for some time. Now, she actually, it was a nice little backstory here that it would be good to give. Polly was a barrister, and she was working in the area of originally in the area of employment law. But she had a bit of a moment of epiphany, you could say. She'd just won a case. She was literally about to kind of hit the big time, if you like, in the legal world. And she actually was looking out of the window of the Royal Courts of Justice in London and realizing that the earth itself needed representation. And the question that she asked herself was, how do we create a legal duty of care for the earth? And so, your question was about approach. Initially, she looked at the kind of rights of nature movement, which is
Mm.
now quite developed around the world. And there are a number of jurisdictions where rights of nature cases have been brought that either assign legal personhood to certain landscapes or various rights of ecosystems. But what she realized was that the real power of protection lies with criminal law, which is what I was just mentioning in terms of criminal law as a protective law. And what she discovered was that in the drafting stages that preceded the agreement of the Rome Statute, which is the treaty that created the International Criminal Court, in the 90s, there was a draft code focused on crimes against peace and security of mankind. And there was a clause in that would have addressed severe, widespread, and long-term harm to the environment. And when she discovered this in the UN archives, and then found that that clause had subsequently been dropped, and so it never actually ended up in what became the Rome Statute subsequently, it was like a moment of, well, this is the missing crime. And for Polly, that's what she dedicated the rest of her life to, is as she saw it, replacing the missing international crime and adding it to the list of international crimes at the International Criminal Court. Now, part of the reason for that sort of particular avenue, if you like, is that if you were to approach individual governments one after the other, and talk to them about this issue, firstly, you would end up having to speak to probably four different ministries in any given government. So environment, justice, foreign, and defense. But when you aim for the International Criminal Court and an amendment to that treaty, anyone that ratifies an international crime is going to be including it then in their own national jurisdiction in a similar form. That's the way that effectively works. So part of the reason for aiming for the International Criminal Court to begin with was to create that coherence, if you like, looking at a practical mechanism that's already in place, that has a system for amendment, and that would effectively create a sort of a coherent definition, which is what this definition was drafted to do, that then individual governments could harmonize with. Now, in practice, what has happened is that when that definition was launched in 2021, so 2 years after Polly passed away, that definition had landed really strongly within the political world, but also within the media world. And I mean, if I could just put it in a personal way, from that moment on, I was no longer able to check all my emails. That is the level of how much attention this initiative began to get and has built up ever since. And it's one of those sort of tragically human things that when Polly was around, because she was such a figurehead, I think a lot of people sort of admired what she was putting forward, but sat back and said, well, she's doing that, so I don't
Yeah.
need to. And of course, when she was no longer there, what happened was extraordinary. People started to get in touch with me and say, this cannot die with her. What can we do to help? And that was campaigners, but it was also lawyers, academics, politicians, faith leaders, all sorts, people from all different sectors and walks of life began to get in touch and say, how can we support this initiative? And that was the beginning of what has become an extraordinary global network that we now operate with.
But you live in the UK,
I do.
and the UK is no longer part of the EU, and you're going around telling countries how they should develop their legal system when you're in a country that left the Union. Don't they push back at you? Who are you to tell us what to do?
Well, we actually don't approach it in that way. I mean, we
Okay.
wouldn't dream of trying to tell a government what to do. What we do is because we over the last, well, I guess it's coming up for 10 years now. We have been working in this sphere for a long time with legal experts, academics, politicians, and policy experts, and we are effectively if you like, a kind of a hub of knowledge, of expertise around this law and around, how it can be put in place. So all we do is offer that expertise. We
So
would
you
we
share best practices.
effectively what we work on with legal advisors and ambassadors, ministers, those who are interested to move forward with such legislation, is effectively, connect them to the legal folk that can support that,
Okay.
and that can look at, they can help with fitting it, effectively adapting it to those particular countries. For example, at the moment, our Americas director is working with legal experts in both in practice and in academic spheres in Latin America to adapt the international definition for a model law that can then be used by the countries in that region, and working with that
Oh,
region to do that. So our approach is absolutely collaborative. We would never dream of telling anybody what to do, but it's proving to be the right concept and the right legal direction of travel at the right time. In the sense that, I mean, as I mentioned, I mean, the concept is actually 50 years old, but it's right now with the growing awareness around, ecosystem collapse, around biodiversity loss, around pollution, around climate, all of these issues are bringing environmental concerns to the fore. And of course, what we're seeing with multilateral environmental agreements is they may be brilliant. I mean, the Kunming-Montreal Agreement, for example, on biodiversity is a fantastic agreement. If everyone followed it to the letter, we'd be in a very different place. But of course, like the Paris Agreement, most of it's effectively non-binding. It's soft law. And what I think there's a kind of growing frustration in so many sectors, including, particularly in the sustainable business sector, but in many sectors, and of course in the corridors of the UN, there's a frustration around implementation. And so a framework that is simple, that can be integrated easily into existing criminal law systems is actually proving to have quite a concrete appeal at this time.
and the you've been doing this quite a while. It's not like from a couple of weeks ago.
Not at all.
You've been working at this quite a while. So you're probably going to start see some big breakthroughs in the next 2 to 3 years, I would imagine. Um, and that will create this kind of snowball effect that others will, oh, well, they got it, because most governments are lazy. They don't want to do all the heavy lifting and figure things out. Asia looks at what did the EU do on their
Hmm.
reporting system. Let's adapt it rather than, start from zero. When when and where can we expect the ribbon cutting ceremony of you and your team in front of Parliament of which country?
Well, it's really interesting, actually. I mean, we tend not to, be the ones at the forefront of the ribbon cuttings
No,
because
that's
that's not,
okay. That's
that's
okay.
not what we do. It's actually the governments themselves that take those steps. But I think it's probably worth highlighting that there have been a few of those moments already,
Oh,
because the EU has already taken significant steps in this direction. In 2024, they adopted a revised environmental crimes directive that covered around 20 crimes that originate in various aspects of EU law. But they also included what they called a qualified offence to address conduct comparable to ecocide. And they actually used that language in the preamble to that directive. So already there are certain areas of pollution, habitat destruction, hazardous waste management, all of these crimes that are related to many areas that now have a kind of, if you like, an aggravating factor that raises that to the level of ecocide. And that's already included in EU law and is being transposed as we speak in EU member states. There's also been an actual proposal at the International Criminal Court from three Pacific Island states, Vanuatu, Fiji, and Samoa, to add ecocide to the list of international crimes alongside genocide, war crimes,
hmm.
crimes against humanity, and so on. And so that is already on the table at the International Criminal Court. And one of the big players from Africa, Democratic Republic of the Congo, has already very vocally and publicly backed that initiative and is indeed being very vocal also in regional fora in Africa. For example, the African Ministers' Conference on the Environment last year, and countries like Republic of Congo, or Congo Brazzaville as it's known, and Burundi have already got behind that. And there's a whole conversation now evolving across Africa being led by the Democratic Republic of Congo. And then what we're seeing, I think that the kind of common factor with the countries that are really moving forward with this initiative is that effectively they're victim states in various ways. So obviously with the Pacific Islands, they're looking at the kind of frontline impacts of climate change. With the Democratic Republic of Congo, it's they're home to the second lung of the world, to the biggest rainforest and the most richest biodiversity, which has been kind of under threat from various exploitative projects where effectively, potentially foreign investors come in, create a mess, leave, there's no accountability, all of those kinds of things. And then on a third category, we're looking at countries like Ukraine, and now, of course, potentially countries also in the Middle East. But Ukraine's been an amazing voice in this because they've really tried to raise the profile of nature in the context of conflict, and pointing out that nature has been the silent victim in wartime contexts, but often the environmental harm is the harm that spreads the furthest, that doesn't respect political borders, and that also lasts the longest. I mean, there are huge areas that will be uncultivable now for decades, for example. So, they have talked about ecocide a lot. So we're seeing that there's a kind of range of contexts where ecocide becomes very applicable, and it is the countries that are suffering from those contexts that are the ones that are really bringing this forward. But at the same time, we are seeing, as I was mentioning with the EU, we are seeing progressive governments also moving forward with this. And in specific examples, we could look at Belgium, which has actually passed a federal law on ecocide, which is effectively treating it as an international level crime, but within its own jurisdiction. France has taken a certain step towards that. They've acknowledged ecocide as an offence, but not actually as a criminal offence. So there's a little bit of a way to go there. But you can see that these countries are starting to move this forward. This is not a kind of isolated initiative. It's now becoming much more broadly discussed across the world.
Are you also trying to engage with the UN to get them to adopt it, or is that a bridge too far?
Well, it's not so much about it being a bridge too far. It's about it being the most relevant context. So there was actually a resolution put forward at the UN Environment Assembly by Vanuatu last year, which was actually they've decided to actually now put it on hold, and if it's likely to return at the next UN Environment Conference, which will be at the end of next year. And there's certainly been discussion within the UN General Assembly. There have been more than one head of state bringing up the issue of ecocide in front of the UN General Assembly. But in terms of where these laws get passed, it's not the UN that does that. So
Mm.
if you want to look at criminal law, the international mechanism is the ICC, the International Criminal Court, but there are regional mechanisms like the EU, like for example the African Court of Justice and Human Rights. The Inter-American Court of Human Rights has issued, along with the International Court of Justice, has issued advisory opinions on climate change that can't legislate for criminal law, but which set out the obligations of states and actually highlight that under existing law, governments already have a duty to prevent severe harm. So you've got a kind of context creation happening there. But the actual legislation itself will ultimately always happen at the national level.
Mm.
Courts like the International Criminal Court or like the regional courts are meant to be complementary, if you like, for when national courts can't or won't act.
Have you ever engaged an organization called Apolitical?
What, a specific organization called that?
Yeah, it's called Apolitical. What it is they look at what are the best practices around the world from various governments on various issues, and they share those best practices with everyone, kind of an open source foundation funded by quite a few people, but Daniel Sachs, he's a wealthy Swedish guy. So if you
It
check out,
sounds like we should be having a conversation with them.
you should. He should be funding you also. You should reach out to Daniel. He's pretty accessible, and he's backing Apolitical. I think he calls it differently on his LinkedIn page. But that might be helpful, not in getting the governments to embrace, but sharing practice from others to
Absolutely.
kind of augment what you're doing. You might also want to, I don't know if you know Paula Caballero.
Paula Caballero. I
So
don't
we
think
did
we've
a
met
we
her.
did a podcast interview. You can see it on our YouTube channel. She was the one that came up with the UN SDGs when she worked at the UN.
Right. Hmm.
So she works now, I think, at the Nature Conservancy on biodiversity and stuff like that. She's a good soul, so might be helpful sharing experiences or maybe some tips. But it was heavy lifting within the UN of coming up with the SDGs, and I'm sure not everybody gave her a big hug when she came up with that idea.
Well, we're big fans of the SDGs, but we also think that without something like ecocide law in place, it's actually quite difficult to fulfill them because you
Mhm.
still have the sort of old systems in place. I mean, we have to realize that company law as it exists now has its origins in a time when we probably still considered natural resources to be pretty much infinite, and certainly not to be in deep and imminent threat as we now understand them to be. So, effectively, we can have as many targets and goals as we like, and they're very important. But in order to support those, we do need to we need to not only be talking about what we do want to do, we need to also be talking about what we should not be doing in order to enable those goals to
And you
manifest.
focus mainly on the national level, right? Not on the city level.
We are actually, it's interesting you asked that because we've recently begun to connect with, sorry, excuse me, my cat
Yeah,
is,
I see your cat.
yeah,
That's okay.
here she is. Hello.
Hello.
She likes to join in. Yeah, we've recently started connecting with the UCLG, which is the local and oh gosh, I'm trying to remember what it stands for now. But it's about local and municipal governments, and groups like the C40 and these
Oh,
kinds
okay.
of.
But not specifics like the new mayor from New York would probably be interested in this idea.
He might
And
be, although I have to say that the America right now is not our top target.
okay. All right. Well, I mean,
Um,
Trump
but
always never fails to fail, so he will, crash and burn.
at some point, perhaps.
Yeah.
Yes.
When you mentioned also about Agent Orange, and there's an interesting story about Agent Orange and napalm and Brent Spar. So the company that made that in the 60s, Dow Chemical, or um, is now looked at, I think they merged with DuPont, as a superhero in sustainability. And one of the reasons that they were forced to change is not because of litigation against them. It's because nobody wanted to work for them during the Vietnam War. They had built up such a horrible reputation as the manufacturer of Agent Orange and napalm that no one wanted to work there. And if you're a big multinational and no one wants to work for there from the best and brightest, you're going to have a problem. That happened with Shell and Brent Spar when they wanted to dump Brent Spar. There was a boycott and they had lots of problems, and also nobody at cocktail parties want to say, "Hey, I work at Shell. You should come also here." So that that's
I
a
think
side, but a lot of people don't know that.
I think
Uh,
it's actually a really important issue because, and I think it's one of the aspects, in the sort of from the business perspective, that's very important about this legal initiative because, effectively, there is already a kind of quite a big shift in terms of who people want to work for, who people are happy to work for, and if a company is willing to say yes, we support as many are starting to do now, we support this law in moving forward. That is effectively a kind of a badge of honor in terms of ecological safety, if you like, in terms of practices, because what it does is it creates a kind of a reality check on even sort of before projects get begin to happen. You've got at the sort of design level of projects, you're actually looking at what does this do on the ground? Is it likely to create severe, widespread, and long-term harm? We are considering that. We are looking at that. We are not assuming that we can externalize the costs of the damage that we do. And that willingness and that sort of principled stance is becoming ever more attractive. And I think on the other side of the balance, it's also a kind of playing field leveler because at the moment, if you're working if you have if you have a triple bottom line, if you are working towards sustainable development goals, if you're a business that is in that space, you are constantly, in a sense, pushing the boulder up the hill because finance is like water; it will continue to flow where it's allowed to flow.
hmm.
So unless one actually closes certain channels, then that that's always going to be something that you're concerned with. Whereas once everybody has to treat effectively environmental safety the way they treat health and safety right now, then, once that happens, then you've got a much more level playing field. I mean, no one's going to go to a government and say, can I have a license to kill 500 people for my new infrastructure project? I mean, it's not even going to cross their mind, right? But you still have a situation where you can, request a license for something where you don't actually have those parameters in place. I mean, nobody's going to build a factory so that it almost breaks people's heads open all the time. They're going
Hmm.
to know that if people do break their heads open, they can be held responsible. And that principle is very much what's at play with ecocide law.
And I mean, getting a law in place that addresses criminal law
Hmm.
with punishment. I understand the strategy and some things that for me might seem criminal, like for me, the fossil fuel industry are just heroin dealers or meth dealers, and will I get a law saying yes, the fossil fuel are meth dealers? Probably not. But basically, what they produce and what they generate income from and benefits a large number of people is total environmental destruction on many, many levels. But it makes money and the pensioners get, nice return. So it's not illegal there. But hopefully that people will see climate change is not about sacrifice, it's about resilience. And by focusing on that, they'll see we should maybe with the war in Iran, people will realize, hey, this is the second time in a few years we got this shock. First was the war in Ukraine, and energy consumption went down a third, and nobody, severely died because they had to lower their thermostat. Um, but you're taking on a very tough one. And I'm sure a person, oh, those guys with all the money and it was destructive, but they're not going to be brought to court as ecocide.
Well, I think the important thing is that with a conversation like this, it's so it's so common sense that it's actually quite difficult to argue against it publicly. We know that there are probably people behind closed doors not wanting this to go through. There's certainly that possibility. But we've already long passed the stage, I think, when any government is going to jump up and down and say, no, we don't want to do this law because they're just going to look terrible. And as for the really big polluters, I mean, a lot of them have spent the last 20 to 30 years greenwashing. And that's obviously cost them an awful lot of money. Now, if they publicly come out and say, oh, we don't want this law, then that's going to undermine all of that investment. So, it's one of the reasons why part of our work is about public narrative, because the more this is in the public space, the harder it is to argue with. And, I mean, I know you're saying that it's a kind of a tough cause to champion, but at the same time, I mean, the speed, the sheer pace of this of developments around ecocide law has been almost breathtaking. I mean, that may be partly due to our work. We know that we've been instrumental in it, but it's certainly not only down to that. It's down to this moment in time where the public awareness of the environmental risks, the ecological collapse, climate change, all of these things is at a level it's never been before. And governments and businesses and environmental cause everybody is frustrated with the lack of concrete action. And I think that, if in a way, is kind of opening a channel for this discussion to land well at many, many different levels. And when I tell you that there are sort of 15 plus countries that have proposals of ecocide law moving through their
Wow.
parliaments nationally. That we've already talked about those sort of regional and international developments. I mean, and in terms of sort of government endorsement, there's already been over 30 governments that have publicly endorsed the recognition of ecocide as a serious crime. We had a resolution passed at the IUCN World Congress in Abu Dhabi last year, which is, I mean, if you're familiar with the IUCN, you'll know that it has a unique makeup of
Yeah,
NGOs and state agencies and
right.
ministries. And there was a resolution endorsing the criminalization of ecocide that was strongly passed in that assembly, including by all the state players. Not, I mean, not all of them, but, a significant number of state players
Mm.
passed it. More of them in favor than abstained. So, so we're seeing that sort of snowball factor is already starting to gather that momentum, which is not before time as far as we can see.
One other person I just thought of that you should also reach out to, Carolyn Dennett.
I'm writing down all these names as you're
So she
bringing them
was
up.
a senior HR advisor to Shell
Okay.
and a lot in Nigeria. And she quit in very vocal fashion
Yeah.
and is very, very outspoken against the oil and gas sector. So she might be a good kindred spirit for you because she was there as a health and safety person
Mm.
and just realized this is just rubbish what I'm doing. Uh, and okay, and saw the vast pollution that was happening there. So Carolyn Dennett, Dennet, nice person. I would also reach out to her because this interview will be up next week. We'll process
Okay.
um, over the weekend, Monday, and then we put it out on Tuesday, and then we added to the TBLI Weekly that goes to about 75,000 readers.
That's amazing.
I'm
Oh,
curious,
oh, oh,
do you have children?
I do. I do. I have two
And
teenage
I
children.
mean, when you sitting around the table and mom is talking about all of this stuff, and they really just want to talk about K-pop and pop culture, and enough with the ecocide. How about something fun? or are they actually just as motivated as you are?
Um, well, I guess they've kind of, grown up with what I've been doing. So, I mean, I think they may not say it every day, but I think and hope that they're proud of what I do. They're engaged in different ways. My daughter's a performer.
Oh,
She's about to go off to musical theatre school. So,
oh, nice.
that's, and hey, the world may go to hell in a handbasket, but people are still going to want entertaining. So, I'm certainly not going to object to that.
And what is your biggest challenge at the moment? Because it seems you're getting momentum. The time seems to be on your side. The shift of policy. I mean,
Mm.
Paris, even though Anne Hidalgo closed off most of the streets for bicyclists, another bicyclist became the new mayor. When even though there was a big push against him, so progressives are winning.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, our biggest challenge is generally to do with assumptions that people make, particularly about criminal law. Gosh, I'm sorry, my cat is absolutely determined to be part of this
That's
interview.
okay. That's all right.
Hello. Um,
I'll give her byline.
but it's actually the way that people conceive of criminal law is probably the biggest obstacle. So, what we find is that, I mean, it's quite rare that we have a conversation with someone and, within 20 minutes, they're not understanding very clearly why ecocide law is um, an important framework to put in place. But what often, and particularly in the more the economic players, there tends to be an initial reaction that's like, oh gosh, this is about punishment. This is about, am I going to be accused of this thing? Is often where people start. But that's because I think there's this, people tend to forget that, the sort of protective aspect that is so fundamental with criminal law, but also the deterrent aspect and the preventive aspect, and the way that actually what it does is steer behavior in a healthy direction. And I think, once that sort of understanding is there, a lot of the benefits become self-evident. Um, so we think that our main sort of obstacle is really an informational one. And the other thing that's interesting, and you did allude to it briefly earlier, is that, governments, I mean, you described them as lazy, we would describe them as busy, in the sense that, I mean, one of the great advantages to having a definition of ecocide that fits on the back of a business card is that politicians are always up to their ears in things that they're having to do. So having effectively the
Hmm.
availability of the expertise, the knowledge base, the support that they need to move something like this forward is absolutely crucial. And so, in a way, sort of at that kind of political diplomatic level, we find ourselves sort of playing a very kind of strong, sort of supportive, advisory kind of a role, because so many people are keen to see this move forward, but simply don't necessarily know where to start with the expertise, with knowing who's moving it forward already. So a lot of, and we've kind of moved from at our beginnings being, if you like, quite a sort of activist organization making demands. We've had to transform completely. And actually over the years, we've really had to become diplomats, because this is not about creating confrontation. This is about assisting those that understand the importance and the necessity for these frameworks, because existing frameworks are simply not cutting the mustard, as we say in England. Um,
In places like Latin America, which has a lot of, in Africa, a lot of problems of gold, precious metal mining with mercury and really polluting the water system there. Doesn't already the local or the national laws there cover that type of ecocide?
Well, I wish they did. I mean, for
Oh,
example,
they don't. It doesn't
there's a
cover it.
very live conversation, for example, in Ghana right now,
Yeah.
where there is a strong call for ecocide laws to be put in place because of the illegal gold mining that is so rife over there. And as with every activity, there are ways and ways of going about it. I mean, this is one of the, I mean, we know that mining is not going to stop, for various kinds of metals or various, but there are
No.
huge differences in how it can be approached, where it can be done, how it can be regulated, what can be put in place to deter and prevent the worst practices. And I think that's actually really important in conversations like in Africa and Latin America. And we've had, I mean, anecdotally, we've had some really interesting things go on. Like, for example, a mining outfit in Latin America that didn't want to sign various environmental agreements that were part of it, the setup, and the lawyer who was dealing with it actually putting the ecocide definition in front of them and saying, do you realize this is coming down the line? And them kind of going, oh right, well we better sign these things then. So these the shifts are starting to happen. And what's really important is this is not a law that is anti-development. It is anti-danger. It is anti-destruction. It is effectively a safety law that is, that can help to guide investors that are coming into areas that, which are resource rich, but making sure that they're not coming in and effectively those countries not having the ability to hold them to account. I mean, this is one of the reasons that African countries are interested in moving forward with this, with this kind of legislation, because it actually gives them something, some kind of parameter to be able to hold those players to account, and also to show leadership. To actually say, yes, we're going to develop, but we're going to do it in a way that actually protects our communities and protects our ecosystems to the best of our ability. And that in turn is quite appealing then to investment as well. I mean, the International Corporate Governance Network, which you're probably familiar with, which has a membership of all the big financial players, your Vanguards, your BlackRocks, your pension funds, etc. They have actually already several years ago, they were writing to the climate COP secretariats advising governments to legislate for ecocide, because that actually represented a move in the direction of safety. And in the same way, we've seen the Race to Zero crew, the climate champions, etc., putting reports together like the exponential playbook for businesses that that want to actually take action in relation to climate and environment. And big players like Google and Microsoft have signed off on that playbook. And one of the things it is demanding is support for legislation around ecocide. So it may seem surprising, but when you think it through, it's actually logical, because you want your money to be creating something that is going to continue to create returns, that's not going to end up with stranded assets, that's not going to end up with territorial damage, or indeed the kind of thing that you brought up earlier, which is, employee dissatisfaction. I mean, all of these areas are safeguarded by putting something in place that simply says, don't trash the place.
Mhm. Did you explore also the whole blood diamonds um, issue of various countries in Africa that were trying to come up with ways of preventing those blood diamonds getting on the market? There was a gentleman, Martin Rappaport, who there was also a documentary about. He wanted to create kind of fair trade diamonds. He also created a diamond index. That might
I mean,
be actually a good collaborator. He's still quite influential in the diamond space. He was trying to create fair trade diamonds in Sierra Leone, which is not not the easiest place to operate.
well, there are some places that are leading in that. I mean, Botswana is more of a leader in terms of the ethical diamond trade. And I mean, I know they're looking to diversify in various different directions, but it's absolutely those kinds of, and there are also gold protocols as well that have been being developed to create, effectively to set standards for the extraction and trade of precious metals, so that they are not as destructive as and effectively criminally inclined as historically has been the case. So those steps are being taken by certain countries and certain supply chains and so on. And ecocide law effectively supports, would support those kinds of directions of travel in terms of best practices. So yeah, I mean, it's absolutely relevant.
So you feel quite optimistic for the next few years that more things will fall into place, which will accelerate the rest because the herd will start to form.
there's definitely that herd thing. I mean, that bell curve that Simon Sinek was looking at in terms of the adoption of ideas. I
Mm.
mean, we're kind of, we're past that initial stage. We're into the kind of beginnings of early majority, I think, but we're not yet quite at the full kind of herd, if you like. But yes, we are optimistic, and which may sound strange in an international, a sort of geopolitical landscape that is chaotic, that is fragmented, that is polarizing, and the same with the media landscape. But I think what we've also discovered in terms of the countries that we're working with is that the majority of sovereign states, at least in terms of numbers, if not in terms of economic clout, are absolutely do want international law. They do want protective legal frameworks. And, just because there are some big players that are ignoring those frameworks does not mean that those frameworks are not valid and that actually the majority of countries, as well as the majority of civil society, I would say, are absolutely supportive of international law. And ecocide law in particular seems to be providing a kind of a unifying narrative that is non-political, non-partisan, of universal value and relevance, that is actually quite a welcome anchor in the sort of rather stormy seas of what is currently happening. And certainly we fundamentally believe that it's a foundational piece that should always have been in place. I mean, we wouldn't even be in the environmental and climate crises that we're experiencing had a law like this been in place decades
Mm.
ago. So it's just the right moment to put it there, but it will become a fundamental foundational piece for any kind of functioning human civilization, because it's just that kind of basic rule of don't saw off the branch that you're sitting on. I mean, we have to acknowledge that we are deeply dependent upon the integrity of ecosystems.
And if it's true that you're getting momentum and things are going your way, you're not having any mining gangsters following you around or threatening you when they come to your doors as, hey, you got to, pushing back because
Well, it's
it
interesting
will
because,
impact them.
well, not anymore, no. But there was a
Oh, but they
stage.
did follow, they did
But there,
gangsters did knock
yeah,
on your
there
door.
was a stage where
Oh,
Polly
good.
Polly did have people following her. She did
Okay.
receive threats. She did have things, hacked or stolen, those kinds of things. Um, and at that stage, if she had, I mean, which was really, I mean, it wasn't sort of, it was at the early years of us working together, and at that stage, potentially removing her from the equation might have made a difference. At this stage, it's way too late for that.
Okay.
We're now in, as I say, in a position where we're informing, supporting, advising, but whether we were there or not, this is now something that is absolutely, the train has left the station. Let's put it that way.
Okay. Okay, good for you. Good for you. How can we help you or those that are going listening and will listen to this interview? What can we do to help you? I mean, other than just throwing money at you, because I don't get the impression that that's the issue. I think it's just more partners to
I think
support.
it's really both. I mean, obviously, if people want to throw money at us, we're very happy. We've always operated with a very short sort of cash flow position because we've got an incredibly passionate team and we've simply been making it happen as we go. So yeah, I don't think we've ever been completely stable financially. So anyone that wants to contribute in that way, hugely welcome.
Sounds
However,
like us.
you're also right that partnerships and conversations are really important. So most politicians, as we all know, don't like to be the first at a party. If they're
No,
going to
no.
move forward on an issue, they want that issue to be something that's safe to talk about. So obviously, the broader the conversation, the faster it moves, if you like, which is why we tend to sort of engage very strongly with many different sectors in order to, effectively sensitize as many different areas as we can to this concept. Also, not least because it is, as a legal framework, it's kind of a bit like a Swiss Army knife when it comes to, the future of civilization. I mean, it supports so many different things, whether it's safety of investments, whether it's just preventing harm, whether it's aligning with attitudes to nature that we absolutely need to adopt in order to exist in harmony with our planet, all of these different areas. So yeah, it's conversation and working with us always fantastically useful.
Yeah, you might also want to keep an eye on the, I mean, a lot of the big institutional investors are finally waking up that the cheapest way to address climate is still restoring the biosphere. There's no,
Absolutely. I mean, I think this is a brilliant, I'm so glad you pointed that out because I think the whole climate space tends to be, emissions obsessed, which I'm not saying it's not important, but if we didn't have, if we destroy the climate regulating ecosystems, the marine, the forest, the soils, the hydrological cycles, we still have a climate crisis and we still have, major safety issues on our planet. I mean, if you look at the planetary boundaries diagrams for this year, you'll actually see that, the most kind of into the red that we've gone is actually in species extinction, biodiversity loss, chemical pollution and all of those kinds of things, even beyond where we are with climate. So it's really important that those dots get joined. So that's absolutely important. But what I will also point out in terms of when you're talking an investment, you're talking potentially, in our case, you're talking philanthropic funding, it's interesting how little gets focused on the systemic pieces. So even in the arena of, earth jurisprudence, earth law, rights of nature, all of these things, a lot of funders are wanting to kind of, take cases or support frontline communities. Now, it's not that those things are not important, but the proportion that goes on initiatives like what we're doing, which are actually shifting the entire system from within, is really quite small. So effectively, that a little bit of longer vision, a bit of more far-sightedness in that arena would be super, super helpful.
I mean, it, just remember these statistics. There's nearly 5 times more wealth than there is global GDP. So there's 5 pounds chasing 1 pound.
Yeah.
A lot of it is tied up in real estate, but there's still a lot of cash out there. And nearly all of the climate tech funds and companies are not going to impact climate at all in the short term. Zero. They,
Absolutely. I mean, this is the crazy thing is that actually the value for money
yeah,
of the interventions that organizations like us, that we can make is insane in terms
yeah.
of the cost
But
to impact
but
ratio.
you're not giving 10x. That's the reason why you're not getting supported.
Of course,
So,
because people are looking for a financial return on investment, but
but
it's
they're
no good
looking
having a
for
financial.
a huge financial return. So
Yeah.
a nonsensical company like Climeworks, which raised over $1 billion,
Mm.
it's a machine that they built in Switzerland and in Iceland, and it sucks CO2 out of the air. But they admitted they produce more CO2 than they actually draw down. None of the climate tech funds publish their carbon drawdown. None. They talk about we're going to reduce emissions. Maybe in 5 or 10 years we'll be okay, but none of them impact climate. A tree does it every day. Every,
Absolutely.
and
Absolutely. And it's the cheapest, most effective way
yeah,
of
yeah.
actually balancing out the situation. And, there are some amazing initiatives like, I don't know if you've heard of ARARA, ARARA. And they've got an amazing financial mechanism for supporting the actual, local communities to preserve the Amazon rainforest, for example. And, there have been projects in China, for example, where simply allowing a region to regrow and to regreen has reduced the temperatures in that region by 10 degrees. I mean, these are things that can, but of course, because they don't look like big profits, they tend not to get focused on.
They're not perceived as unicorns.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
that's the issue. The financial sector are just a bunch of used car salesmen with a Rolodex who are chasing 10x, and they're incentivized for short-term behavior. So
Mm,
they're hunters or pirates, and we're talking about farming. So we're trying to teach farming to hunters, which not is not easy. But the good thing is the financial sector is the most predictable group you'll ever meet. There is there is no sorry, there is no group more predictable than the financial sector. They never surprise. And there are many. You should research a little bit. Just go on to, I don't know, Claude, and say who are the leading NBS, nature-based solution investors in the world now. And a lot of the big pension funds are putting money into that, mainly because it's safe, it's
Yeah.
steady, 20 years of payout, and that. So check that out and see if they could be supportive of what you're doing, because they have been supportive in the past, and many of them are creating large nature-based solutions for whatever reason. The banks are they're not interested in climate at all. It's just a product for them. It's a new collateralized debt obligation. This has been actually a joy. One other person that you might want to keep in mind is a woman named Patricia Ricard. So
Okay.
you might not know her, but you're probably, if you ever travel in France, you saw everywhere the drinks of her family business, Ricard,
Of
Pernod.
course. Ah, of course. Yes.
So she's not an investor in sustainability. She has a very large marine research oceanography institute in France, and she's very active in saving the ocean, but also how to create commercial activity in maintaining and protecting the oceans, and well connected, obviously, in France.
Well, I would think that she would definitely be interested because, of
Yeah.
course, I mean, ecocide law is absolutely relevant.
She did,
So,
we did a podcast also with her. A lot of the people I mentioned, we did interviews with. You can check them out either on Spotify or on our YouTube channel. Um, and if anything that we can do to help you, also thank Sue Miller for
I will.
connecting us. That was nice. She didn't throw any tomatoes when I gave my talk at the conference, so that's always encouraging.
Okay, brilliant. Well, thank you ever so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
This has been great. I'm going to stop the recording. Okay.